Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this evening's webinar entitled U.S. Soccer and Why It Matters. My name is James Kenley, Executive Director for the Vail Symposium. On behalf of Dale Mosier, our board chairman, and the entire Vail Symposium board, welcome. The Vail Symposium has been offering affordable, thought-provoking programming to the Vail community since 1971. There are two items I want to make you aware of before we get started tonight. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to submit questions. You can type those in at any time, and we'll get to them towards the end of the program. This will run until about 7 o'clock this evening. It is being recorded, and the video will be available at vailsymposium.org. I'd like to thank the organizations and individuals who have helped make tonight's program possible. Our presenting sponsors are the Town of Vail and the Frechette Family Foundation. Our event sponsors are the Vail Daily, Vail Resorts Epic Promise, and the Antlers at Vail. Our virtual programs are sponsored by Alpine Bank, and the winter season is underwritten by Jeannie and Dale Mosier. Ticket fees cover less than 15% of our operating revenue, and webinars like tonight are offered at no cost to our community. Donors at every level make our programming possible. Thank you for your support. Next week, we have two very different and equally wonderful programs. On Tuesday, January 31st, our Conversations on Controversial Issues series with humanities scholar Clay Jenkinson tackles voting rights with Professor Doug Spencer and reporter and author Aaron Geiger Smith. This program will be at the Eagle River Presbyterian Church from 6 to 8 p.m. The next night, Wednesday, February 1st, Clay will take the stage to bring us back in time. As one of the foremost scholars on Lewis and Clark, Clay will shed new light on their famous expedition and bring those explorers to life as people beyond our history books. This will be at the Edwards Interfaith Chapel from 6 to 7:30. These programs and many more can be found at vailsymposium.org. Tonight, we discuss U.S. soccer and why it matters. Fresh off the heels of a thrilling World Cup tournament this fall and an inspiring performance by our young men's squad, and in eager anticipation of the two-time defending World Cup champion U.S. women's team heading to Australia and New Zealand this summer, our discussion today will cover a broad range of topics. It's my pleasure to introduce our host this evening, Nate Scott. He's a senior director at USA Today Sports Media Group. He was part of the founding team of social sports blog For the Win and is a co-producer and host of The Sneak, a true crime by athletes podcast that has been downloaded over 2.5 million times. Get it wherever you get your podcasts. As a reminder, please put your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and Nate will let me know when we're ready for audience questions. To get us started and to introduce our special guest, Neil Buethe, the Chief Communications Officer for the U.S. Soccer Federation, please welcome Nate Scott.
Thank you, James. Really appreciate the introduction, and thank you all so much for having me. I will be the host of things. I'm not terribly important in the entire proceedings here, other than being someone who loves the game of soccer, and just excited to be here to act as a little bit of a host. Neil is the man we're here to see, though. Neil Buethe is the Chief Communications Officer for U.S. Soccer, where he serves as the primary spokesman for the Federation and oversees the communication and media strategy for the men's and women's national team, along with youth and extended national teams, coaching, high performance, referee departments. If it has to do with U.S. Soccer, Neil is running the communication strategy. He served as the U.S. press officer for the youth teams as well. We're delighted to have him. Usually he and I are sparring over something one of my writers has written. So it's really nice to be able to just talk with Neil about the game that we both love. So Neil, welcome.
Nate, thank you very much. And we don't do that too much sparring. You guys are good. You get your facts right. So, but thanks for the introduction, and I'm really excited to be here.
So before we dive into this great World Cup that we just had, which I do want to speak a little bit about, I do think it's important to kind of set the stage for soccer in the United States. I think for me at least, and I think for a lot of folks, our entry into the game was either through the '94 Men's World Cup in the United States, or perhaps the 1998 Women's or '96 Women's World Cup. What was it, '99? Forgive me. But Brandy Chastain famously ripped off her shirt after winning in penalty kicks. There is a long and storied tradition with U.S. soccer, though, that extends way beyond that. So I'd love to get just a brief summation of kind of the history of U.S. soccer and where it's come to get to the point that we're at today.
Yeah, sure. And I'll go way back. So the federation actually was created in 1913. So in 2013, we actually celebrated our centennial 100th anniversary. And at that point, obviously, we just had a men's team. And they were competing internationally. We competed in the first World Cups in 1930, actually getting to the semifinals. And then we had some similar success in a World Cup in 1950, if people remember, big defeat over England 1-0, one of the biggest defeats in a World Cup ever. And then on the men's side, things kind of went silent for a while. There we call it the Dark Ages from 1950 to 1990, when we finally qualified again for a World Cup. And obviously it's been on a rise ever since. And then on the women's side, we were one of the first federations to have a women's national team. That started in 1985. And very quickly, our women's national team became one of the best in the world and is still ranked, obviously, number one right now. And winning the first World Cup in 1991, which wasn't even called the World Cup then. They called it like the M&M World Championship, which was played in China. 99, obviously, and then we know the past two World Cups as well. So our women's national team has been a dominant force in the soccer landscape for a long time. And so that's a quick history. Obviously, the only other thing I would say about the federation is it's not just our men's senior teams, men and women. We have, as you mentioned, a number of youth teams on both sides, boys and girls, and then extended national teams, which is our cerebral palsy team. We have a deaf women's and men's national team, a futsal men's and women's national teams. We have beach men's and women's national teams, and a power team, which is wheelchair soccer. So we probably, as any federation in the world, have more national teams than anyone. And all of those teams are vitally important to the federation, and continuing to try and strive for, the highest performance we can get, and obviously bringing more fans into all those national teams to watch them as they play across the country and across the globe.
And last thing to sort of set the stage here is U.S. Soccer Federation. What does that mean exactly? How are you guys set up sort of as an organization? What is your edict? Is it different in other sports from sort of the Olympic Committee or professional teams? Like how are you guys sort of organized?
Yeah, we're the governing body of the sport. So along with our youth national teams, we also have licensing for coaches. We have referee development programs. So referees can go from grassroots to high school, college, and then on to the pros. We obviously are making sure that the sport is growing in all areas. So while people are most aware of our senior national teams and the professional leagues, MLS, NWSL, USL, really we are also concentrated on the grassroots part of the sport, which is youth, right? And so many people who have kids that are playing, and many of us who grew up playing, AYSO, USYS, US Club, but then there's also adult soccer as well. And so all that fits under our membership. We have about 113 members. That's state associations and organizations, like I mentioned, AYSO and USYS. And our edict is to grow the game and find ways to work with our entire membership to continue to do that. And really, U.S. Soccer's focus on kind of three areas. One is participation, right, on youth and adult. fandom, right? Continuing to bring people into the game, and then development. And really development is performance, right? So making sure that all our teams are performing at the highest level, and like our women's national team, winning World Cups and being ranked #1 across the globe.
Let's talk about the World Cup we just had. Truly incredible. We had a World Cup final that I had to tell my non-soccer watching friends that they're not all this exciting. It doesn't always feature the two best players in the world in a penalty kick shootout thriller where they both score multiple goals. But
Nate, you're not supposed to tell them that. You're supposed to tell
yeah,
them that.
sorry, they're all like that. Yeah, exactly. They all feature that much excitement. But we had this dream final between, Lionel Messi, probably the greatest of all time, and Kylian Mbappe, who's a French player who's the heir apparent to being, probably the greatest player, if he's not already there. The U.S. team, though, also had, I think by all accounts, an incredibly successful tournament, getting out of the group stage, which I think most people had sort of set as kind of the barometer for success. But I am sort of curious, from you, from sort of an organizational standpoint, there is being on the ground and kind of the communications, challenges and of being in a foreign country and working with the national team. But back looking at sort of the United States audience, I'm curious how you guys kind of measure success. Like when the World Cup is over and you're sort of doing all right, let's look at everything that just happened. I'm curious if you're looking at audience numbers or engage time or youth or age of watch. Like I'm curious how you guys are sort of using metrics to measure your success when looking at a World Cup.
Yeah, no, and I think maybe I'll go back a little bit to a good way to kind of answer this. I mean, first of all, performance is #1, right? I mean, you want to win a World Cup. I mean, you don't go into World Cup hoping you get out of the group and that's great. It's never like that for the team or the players. They are always striving to win the World Cup, and that's the conversation within the bubble. And so, it's unfortunate and it's disappointing when you get knocked out. And what I really appreciated about this young group of players, and I know we'll talk a little bit more about how young they really are, is that they were upset. They weren't walking out of that Netherlands game going, well, we had a good World Cup. They were upset that they could have done better, that they had an opportunity to, move on to the next round. And that's what you want to see. So there's the performance part of it, right? You're always trying to strive for that. And to your point, the other things we look at, our broadcast numbers, right? How many people are watching? We have our social media metrics, how many people are engaging with our accounts. We have, the amount of jersey sales and how many people are buying the gear, how many people are buying tickets in the lead up to our games, before we left and then after. So it's all those things. But one thing I mentioned I wanted to go back to was, I started in 2003 at the Federation. So I've been there almost 20 years. And my first World Cup was in 2006. And for those that don't remember, in 2002, the men went on a very good run, lost in the quarterfinals to Germany, could have won that game and went on to the semifinals. Kind of a surprise situation, especially after 1998 World Cup, where they were the worst team in the World Cup, 32 out of 32. And so a lot of people weren't paying attention to that 2002 team and surprised them. And it was over in Japan and South Korea and different times, middle of the night games. So maybe not as much interest, even though they went on that run. But it because of that, people started paying attention more. In 2006, my first World Cup in Germany, we got knocked out of the first round. And it was very disappointing, right? That occurred. But I remember going back to the office. And this is like, before social media, the website was really just brand new. We were, you were finding different ways, though, where fans were starting to engage with you and reach out. And people were mad. They were sending us emails and yelling at us and leaving phone messages and finding any way to reach out to tell us that wasn't good enough. And we were like, this is great. People care. People are paying attention. Like, we're like, this is amazing. Listen to this message. Listen to this, read this email. And so it was like, hey, people are really passionate and care about the sport and are engaged. So let's just continue to figure out how we grow it. And so Yeah, all those things I mentioned before are ways we kind of measure it. And there's a definite connection though to performance and interest, of course, right? And so we want to continue to perform at the highest level because that'll bring more fans in. The more fans that are interested will help us with revenue. Revenue will be put back into the game, and it's this, continual cycle that can be beneficial for us to continue to push to be the best teams in the world.
I want to ask you a little bit more about this World Cup, but before we go there, what you just brought up is something that I think about a lot. I work in media and I work in soccer media, and this is something that we're kind of constantly examining and talking about. And I think one thing that is really interesting, especially now, which we've never been able to experience with the U.S. men's national team specifically, but also now the women's national team as well, is being able to watch the European game through the lens of American soccer players. So we always would have players abroad in the past, but you literally couldn't watch them unless you had sort of satellite feeds or knew which kind of bar to go to in whatever part of town that you could get a soccer game on. And I'm curious from you guys as watching sort of these stars and these personalities develop and American fans kind of rallying around these players. I imagine you don't have to wait for the World Cup like you might have used to, where you would sort of have to introduce all these players to the American public. Now, a lot of people know who Christian Pulisic is because he plays for one of the biggest club teams in the world. Does that make your job easier? Does that make it like I'm curious how it has opened doors for you, I guess, from sort of a storytelling perspective and sort of reaching fans about these players?
Yeah, for sure. The players are the ones that are going to drive the interest, right? And so we realize that and understand that trying to get our players out there, and you really want them to become household names. I mean, that has happened on the women's side, right? People know Megan Rapinoe and Alex Morgan, and before them, Abby Wambach and Julie Foudy. And that's because, their performance, and they won, and they're winners, and America loves winners. And so that's part of it, but there's also the opportunity that we have to tell these guys stories and get them out there in different ways. And so we're really focused on how best to do that. I had conversations with Tyler Adams in the lead up to the World Cup, even before we qualified. These are young guys that I think understand the opportunity they have in front of them. They're smart, they're savvy, they understand social media and the impact of things like behind the scenes shows, and they want to embrace all that. That's not always the case with some of the older players that were, hey, I just want to play, and so they understand that dynamic. So how do we help that occur, right? And really our goal, and I said this to Tyler, is you need to be, all of you guys, by the 2026 World Cup, need to be the LeBron James in the America's, psyche. I mean, people should know you like they know LeBron James now, right? And that's going to happen in some ways because the World Cup, which is the biggest sporting event in the world, is going to be on our shores. But how do we put rocket fuel in that and make it happen quicker? And I would say, Nate, I don't think America really knew these guys before this World Cup. They knew Christian Pulisic, some did, but people didn't know who Tim Weah was till he scored. And I guarantee people were Googling Tim Weah and who is this guy? And then they found out, oh, his dad is the president of Liberia. And oh man, he's, was born in the US. So we were prepared to try and tell their stories in that moment and share that information. And so I really hope that we can continue to push that forward on our men's side and our women's side, because our women have a lot of young players coming in, right? That people don't know. And some of the players they do are retiring. So yeah, it's vitally important that we get into lifestyle, get into music, get into all these areas outside of the sport to really get people to find out about these guys and understand who they are and connect with them. And we think that if we can do that in the right way and do that often, do that consistently, these players can be the LeBron James of sports by 26. And that it gives us a huge opportunity to really tell the story of the federation, tell the story of our teams, tell the story of the sport, and continue to grow it across the country.
And for those who might not know, Tyler Adams is the captain of the U.S. men's national team. He is 23 years old. Some of the other ages of the players, Brendan Aronson is 22. Yunus Musa, who started every game, is 20. Weston McKennie is senior leader on the team, and Christian Pulisic are both 24, and Tim Way is 22. These is a incredibly young group of players. And I guess, yeah, it isn't really that people are being introduced to them now. I guess it's more sort of looking forward to 2026. I do have to ask about, I want to get into the women's game in the Women's World Cup. I do have to ask about a kerfuffle that some folks might have read about involving one of those young players, Gio Reyna, who's one of the young stars for the U.S. men's national team, and the head coach for the team, Greg Berhalter, who had disagreements over playing time, I guess would be fair to say. And there was some family drama involving Gio's dad, Claudio Reyna, who is a former U.S. men's national team player and good friend to the head coach, Greg Berhalter. We don't have to hash it all out, but I am curious, Neil, from you, sort of as a communications director, as this is breaking, how is this, what are the conversations like with you internally? What are you thinking about, and sort of how to, even in viewing it, not, I think crisis comms is too strong a word, but how do you view that as sort of a communications challenge when stories like that break?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is it's disappointing for everyone, right? It's a sad story and unfortunate for the players, for the staff, for Greg and his family, and that's really where our concern is how do you handle this in the right way, because there's a lot of people in their lives and reputation kind of at stake there. And it's unfortunate it happened. I think one thing that got lost in a lot of the coverage of the situation is that we actually at the Federation handled the situation, we think, in the right way, and took an allegation seriously and went through the process and got an investigation going, because that wasn't always how things were handled in the past. And the Yates investigation on some of the things in women's soccer showcased, showed that. And so we took the right steps, knowing that this would get a lot of media coverage. And our hope is that we can, wrap up the investigation and wrap up our review. And, as U.S. soccer leadership has said, is Greg is still a candidate, and we will, figure this out in the coming weeks and months, and make a decision on where we're going on the men's program. And it's we want to, there's urgency there, but we don't want to be rushed, because as we just talked about, 2026 is such a big opportunity that you want to get that right and give the 3-year journey with the right staff, the right people in place to lead us into that World Cup.
And for those who might not know, Greg Berhalter, the U.S. coach, his contract expired on December 31st, and we're kind of in a holding pattern. I was hoping maybe we would break some news tonight about who the new coach is, or if it's going to be Greg again, but unfortunately, it doesn't appear that is going to happen. Let's talk about the Women's World Cup. It is, I can't believe it's already happening. It is this summer in Australia and New Zealand. Let's keep the theme going with youth, because I do think, the women, as you said, have become household names, and this generation of stars, I think Carly Lloyd and Alex Morgan and Megan Rapinoe, kind of chief among them, have really sort of become those kind of national crossover stars. But this is a very new team. For the youth on the men's side, I think you have extremely exciting young players, including Trinity Rodman, who Dennis Rodman's daughter, for those who don't know, who is a breakout star both for the U.S. Women's National Team and the NWSL, the National Women's Soccer League. It's a young team, it's a changing team, and also the rest of the world is getting a lot better and starting to invest in the women's game in the ways that the United States did early on, and I think that it's fair to say the rest of the world is catching up. I'm curious how you guys are going to try and maintain a competitive edge as a U.S. Soccer Federation now that we are seeing such quick growth in England and France, especially in Spain as well.
Yeah. It's definitely about continuing that investment, on the senior team and preparing them with the best preparation matches, best environment when they're there, doing all those little things that can add that 1% of difference for us to win games and win another World Cup. No one's won three World Cups in a row. So that is a massive challenge. As you mentioned, so many countries are starting to finally invest like we have for so long and catching up. So it's going to be a massive challenge. The team is also in a transition in terms of some of these young players coming in, and some of the veterans like Carly Lloyd have retired, and then you still have an Alex Morgan, Becky Sauerbrunn, Megan Rapinoe, some of these massive players that are incredibly important as their veteran leadership and performance on the field will vital to the World Cup as well. So Vlatko Andonovski, our head coach, has a massive job ahead of him to try and bring that group together and really be firing on all cylinders when we get over to Australia and New Zealand. And we're still very confident that this team has a great mix of ability across the field to really win their third World Cup in a row and fifth star overall. So we're excited about it. We are actually, the women's national team just got back from 2 games against New Zealand in Auckland and Wellington. And they stayed in the same hotel that they'll stay at for the first part of the World Cup, trained at the same facilities, kind of got used to the environment there. And we did that on purpose, right? To, again, find those little nuggets of opportunity that can really get you to have that best performance when you come back. So excited about it. But again, massive challenge.
And I do think that, we briefly mentioned the other countries sort of investing. I do think that is sort of one of the wilder stories I think I've seen is the growth of the women's game in Europe, where it was forever not invested in, and it was just thought of as not kind of could ever compete with the men's sport, different culture, etc. That's something that people in America are fine with. And the game is growing at a rate there on the women's side that is almost unbelievable. FC Barcelona women had a Champions League game in 2022 that had 91,000 people in attendance. In England, the women's Super League there, regularly seeing massive attendance at Arsenal, at Manchester United, for these big kind of legacy clubs. So I'm very excited for this Women's World Cup. I am very interested at seeing if the US can kind of maintain that level of dominance. But it has been sort of that success story in the United States as well. And I'm curious for you guys, if anything sort of surprised you in terms of how the women's game has grown in this country, both via demographics or just sort of who cares deeply about the women's game?
Yeah, I don't think it's surprised those that at the Federation have been working in the women's game for a long time. That they've seen this coming, knew that it was only a matter of time that other national teams and countries would start investing after seeing, what we've done and kind of using our playbook in a sense. And a lot of the countries you're talking about, like England, have the ability to kind of plug and play, right? They've got these amazing facilities and setups on their men's side, and they can bring in a women's club and just have them train in the same location. So great setup where it's a little bit different, where you don't have necessarily all the MLS teams here in the United States with the same type of facilities and ability to bring in a women's team. College is still a big pathway for our women's national team. But that's changing, right? You're seeing more and more players go directly into the professional game, whether it's here in the US or overseas, which is more similar to how the men's development program is, or pathway is run. I think the biggest thing is that the women's game across the world has a massive opportunity to grow. So the men's sport is going to continue to grow, but not massively. Like it's the biggest sport in the world already, right? But you have a 211 countries under FIFA. All of them have a men's team, and they all try to qualify for the World Cup and play in the World Cup. Of those 211, I think there's about 187 or so, I was looking at this the other day, that have a women's team. But how many of those countries and federations are actually investing in those 187 women's teams? I would say 60, maybe 70 are investing. And so they're not putting any real money into the programming. They're not playing a lot of games. They don't really care about their women's team at all. Now think about it. If every one of those countries invested as much as they did into their men's team, into their women's team, and the women's side of the game grew exponentially, because now you'd have more sponsors, you'd have more broadcasters showing games. Like the opportunity on the women's side is so massive. And what you really need is more of the world to wake up. A lot of Europe has woken up right about it. You've got South American teams starting to invest more, but even like Brazil has been fantastic for years, but they barely invested in their women's team from a programming standpoint. And so Brazil probably should have won an Olympics World Cup, but they just haven't, because they probably haven't really put enough investment into their development programs and their senior team. So think about all the countries in the world that could really take that step. And that's what we're trying to showcase, is like, listen, our women's national team drives attention for us massively. And it could be the same for them as well if they kind of realized it. And again, some are, I think more can. And I think if all of the countries across the world did, the women's game could really take leaps and bounds and would be an amazing thing to watch.
This past year, you guys signed a historic deal with guaranteeing equal pay to the men's and women's teams. Is that been duplicated anywhere else, or are you guys the ones to lead the way on that?
So it hasn't been duplicated exactly in how we did it. So there were some Australia and some other countries have announced, before us that they had an equal pay, but what they didn't actually equalize was the FIFA prize money. So for those that don't know, the teams that qualify for the World Cups on the men's and women's sides and play in the World Cups have the opportunity to earn money as far as they go, right? So the winner of the men's World Cup, at least in 2018, I don't know if I've seen the number in 22, made about $38 million, while the women's side, so the U.S. women's national team, since we won it in 2019, won $4 million. So 38 million compared to 4. So $34 million difference. And the players get the majority of that money. Goes to the federation, but U.S. Soccer sets it up and shares it with the players. So no other country is sharing that money, but our deal, our equal pay deal, splits that money. The federation takes 10%. The women put in their money from their World Cup, the men put in their money from their World Cup, and then they split it evenly. That we're the only country that does that. I know Wales just announced an equal pay deal the other day as well. So you're seeing more countries at least paying their salaries or their bonuses the same from men and women, but the equal prize money is different in terms of our deal. And I'll say this, Nate, we're not trying to tell every other federation in the world to do exactly what we've done, right? We did it because it made sense for us, right? We have two massive national teams, best team in the world on the women's side, a top 20 to 15 team on the men's side. Again, a lot of the federations across the world don't even have a women's team, or they're not investing at all. What you need those federations do is just take the first step. right? Get a women's team. Next step, invest in your women's development program on the girls' side. Do all these things. And over time, hopefully you can get to a position where your two teams are sharing and equal. So it's really about every country figuring out what makes sense for them and investing on the women's side of the game and not just the men's side. So we're really proud of the equal pay deal. Took us a long time to get there, and a lot of back and forth, and didn't always put the federation in the best light. Cindy Parlow-Cohen, our president, who was a former player, World Cup champion, Olympic champion, came in and changed the narrative and really kind of led this process. And a huge tip of the hat to the women's national team players for their drive and never giving up. And then also to the men's national team who, agreed to share their money on the prize for the FIFA prize money. So it was amazing to see all three groups come together as they've all not been aligned in the past. And now that we are aligned, the opportunity for us to work together to grow the sport in this country is pretty massive.
I see a bunch of questions coming in, and so we'll try and move quickly here, but I do want to talk about the 2026 World Cup, which we are one of three hosts of, along with Mexico and Canada. This is, I think, for you, for me, working in soccer media, this is kind of an incredible opportunity for the game, for our coverage of the game. I sit in all day on meetings with potential advertisers, kind of extolling the virtues of the growth of the American soccer game and the American soccer experience. I'm, looking ahead to 2026 and the World Cup being hosted here. I am curious how you're sort of looking at the lens of kind of the opportunity sort of from a business perspective, from an audience perspective, from the branding perspective, loving soccer, not loving soccer. This is a major event in the United States. And I'm curious how you're sort of pitching that to potential partners and how you're kind of viewing what you're hoping will be, at that 2026 World Cup, how you'll be sort of measuring success.
Yeah. And I'll take a step back because, we had the 1994 World Cup in the United States, the first World Cup on the men's or women's side to be hosted in the United States. I was 15 years old, went to that World Cup, and it changed my life. Like the impact that it had on me really drove me deeper into the sport, and I was lucky enough to end up working in it. But I grew up in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and as a 15-year-old, which is 30 years ago now, I could barely follow the sport. I mean, it wasn't on TV. There was no internet, so you couldn't follow any of the clubs in England or Italy or Spain. There was no professional league. MLS didn't exist because it started after the 94 World Cup. There was no real stars to look up to, and it's drastically different now. So a 15-year-old growing up in Green Bay, Wisconsin can watch more soccer in this country than any country in the world. Can go buy the jersey of any player in any league across the world. And I go back and I run into, friends and their dads or grandparents or uncles. And they're like, what do you do? I work in soccer. And they're like, oh, soccer will never make it. And I'm like, yeah, you're a dinosaur. It won't make it for you maybe, but for your grandkids, they know that sport just like the NFL or anything else. So in 30 years, like the impact of that one World Cup, and that's not obviously 99 World Cup, 2003 Women's World Cups, those had major impact as well. So that's all added up to the opportunity that we have now. So when we think about a 2026 World Cup, that is going to be the biggest sporting event ever held. They're moving from 32 teams to 48 teams across the US, Mexico, and Canada. This is such a massive opportunity for an impact for this sport. Our vision at US Soccer is to make soccer the preeminent sport in the United States. That's not going to happen overnight. We're not going to overtake the NFL tomorrow, but a World Cup and a massive event like a World Cup can have such a lasting imprint for the sport in this country. And everyone is focused on that. And the way we look at it is, what will the day after the World Cup look like in this country? What will the sport look like in this country? What do we want it to look like? And it's not going to be bigger than the NFL just because the World Cup's hosted here. But are we putting it on the trajectory we want to get there at some point? And so everyone is invested on, okay, what do we need to do in the next 3 years to make sure that happens? And again, it goes back to those 3 buckets I talked about, participation, continuing to drive kids into the sport. And our participation numbers have been, baseline for many, many years. How do we increase that? How do we get into neighborhoods and communities that, haven't always embraced the sport or haven't had the opportunity to do that? How do we break down those barriers and allow lower income kids really be part of the sport? And then fandom, driving fandom. The more people interested in the sport, the more they're going to watch games, go to MLS games after the World Cup, go to NWSL games after the World Cup, buy more merchandise, do all those things, watch it on TV more, whether it's, the league here or leagues overseas. And then continuing on the performance side, right? Again, it goes back to think about the opportunity we have on the field. If our men's team can compete on the field, and let's all dream that they get to the World Cup final in 2026 on home soil. And I'm not going to say where that will be. Maybe I'll throw out New York, LA, or Dallas. And that number, that broadcast number, Nate, will be bigger than the Super Bowl easily. Think about that. That's a massive opportunity, and why broadcasters see the value of soccer, because they know that as it grows, it has this real big opportunity to bring in more and more fans. So all those things, we think about it. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I get excited about just that high level opportunity of what a World Cup can do in this country to drive the sport. And I'm not just talking men's side, women's side. We talk about those extended national teams, just the entire soccer community is going to be so engaged in it. And there's so much opportunity to bring in the casual fan who maybe isn't always paying attention, doesn't know much about soccer, doesn't pay attention to it. If they can be engaged with this World Cup and see, wow, how global it is, how massive it is, how exciting it is. That's pretty cool.
You've got me excited. I was already excited, but I'm more excited. Neil, man, thank you so much. I see a bunch of questions. So James, I don't know how you want me to handle it. If you want to handle questions, or should I, or I'll
I'm
tip it off
happy
to
to
you.
tee up. I'm happy to tee up some for you both. Thanks again for that conversation. I get the sense that it could have gone on for hours and hours. So thanks for containing your enthusiasm. And for the audience, thanks for sending your questions. Keep them coming. We'll do our best. Nate and Neil, if you can do your best to keep your answers concise, we'll try to get to as many of these questions as we can. We do have a few that I think kind of line up nicely as openers. And the first one, I see the names on this list. I know we have some people who are really fully immersed in the game, but we got a question from someone who I think is not quite as immersed, that I love. The question is for newcomers to the game. Maybe they got pulled into the excitement of the World Cup, or they've got a grandchild who's playing the game. What's a good resource for someone who's new to the game of soccer to learn the ropes and kind of get their feet wet and understand what they're watching?
In terms of understanding the sport, I think, watching games of a high level, whether it's the national teams, men or women, or the professional leagues here in the US, Major League Soccer, NWSL, or overseas, many to choose from, obviously. I think just watching the sport is one thing we always tell young players, and that will help them learn the game. I also think, there's a lot of, you'll be surprised probably if you're just getting into the sport, there's local clubs probably in your area, right? That whether they're youth or adult, you could go out and play yourself if you're up for doing that. And that can be outdoor, indoor, whatever it is. There's going to be youth clubs. There's opportunities probably to get your grassroots coaching license, and you can learn the sport and go that way as well. So I think there's a lot of different avenues for a novice to get into the game.
Right on. Thank you. And this next one, Neil, is definitely for you. We got a few questions along these lines, so I'll try to summarize them. The question is really about understanding U.S. soccer, the U.S. Soccer Federation. How is it funded? Are you getting government money? And maybe how does that compare and contrast with top national teams in other countries?
Yeah, no, this is a question we get a lot, and a lot of people assume that we do get governmental funding. We actually don't. I wouldn't say we don't. We get a small amount. So we're under the USOPC, as an Olympic sport, because we do compete in the Olympics. We get about $600,000 to $800,000 a year from them, but our funding for our programs comes from sponsorship for the most part, and our TV contracts. So we just signed a TV contract with Turner Sports on the English language side and Telemundo on the Spanish language side. One was for 10 years with Turner. And the reports out there are, $25 to $28 million a year. And then Telemundo at a smaller number for a 4-year cycle through 2026. And then sponsorship, we're sponsored by Volkswagen, Allstate, Visa, Budweiser. So those sponsorships obviously bring in money. And then the other approach we have for funding is what we call our development program, which is fundraising. So anyone on this call, if you're interested, I can get you the number to our VP of the development program, and she can take you through all the opportunities that you have to donate to the Federation. And a lot of that goes towards, what we were talking about before, our youth development programs, our youth national teams, our women's national team and girls programming, our extended national teams. So areas where, we don't always have as much funding as we might want. And there's different ways to get into that fundraising opportunity at different levels. And so, yeah, if anyone's interested, I can definitely share information for you, James.
Right on. Thank you. I know we have some individuals here that support U.S. soccer already, so we've got good local resources here as well. Shifting into a little bit more of what happens on the pitch. We've talked a lot about the World Cup. That obviously draws a lot of attention. What role do the smaller tournaments play? CONCACAF, Federations Cup, Olympics. It feels a little strange to call the Olympics a smaller tournament, but the whole world's watching the World Cup. How do those other tournaments, those other competitions play into how you think about the development of the game?
Oh, they're massive. I mean, anytime you're playing in a competition or format like a Gold Cup or an Olympics or a youth national team qualifying tournament or World Cup, those are massive opportunities for a player, right? In terms of preparation for a World Cup, development of that player, also just driving interest, right? Anytime you're playing for a trophy, that's a big deal. And I think, on the men's side, just as an example, right, not qualifying for the World Cup in 2018 was probably the lowest point we've ever been. And Greg Berhalter and Ernie Stewart and the group on the men's side coming in to drive this young team forward. And many of you may not know, we won the Gold Cup and Nations League in 2021. Beating Mexico both times, which is our arch rival. I mean, those are massive things to give our players the opportunity to build confidence going into a World Cup. And it's also a massive opportunity to draw fans in, and fans like winners. So, all those tournaments are important. And the Olympics are massive on the women's side, just because it is a tournament that we've won so many times, but also is right a notch below probably a World Cup in terms of women's soccer. And then Olympics for our men's side is an under 23 tournament. I won't get into all the details there, but we hadn't qualified for one since 2008. And so now that we're back and qualified for this one, that's a fantastic opportunity for some of our younger players.
Nate, I wonder if you could give us kind of a media perspective on that. The whole world's watching the World Cup. I know you love the game, so for you they're probably all a big deal, but how do you think about it from the media and storytelling side?
Yeah, for me, I think, there is sort of the idea of sort of the casual fan and being able to introduce them as Neil and I were talking earlier, but to these kind of cast of characters that we're going to get to know much more deeply over the next 4 years. And for me, from a media perspective, that's what we view a lot of athletes as as Neil said, maybe one day Tyler Adams could be the next LeBron. Like they're not there yet. Tyler's not on a first name basis in the way that a LeBron or a Serena or a Tiger is. But the fact that I can wake up on a Saturday morning and watch every single professional league in the world and watch a U.S. men's national team player playing in Italy and playing in Spain and playing in Germany, or Portugal, Scotland. For me on the media side, what I am seeing is kind of in that dedicated community, which is growing, of kind of US soccer fans, those really passionate fans. These tournaments allow them to kind of check in on these players, and there's just a depth of knowledge that you're not used to seeing in this sport. Something you usually see in like college football, where people are looking at recruiting, boards that have 400 players, and they're looking up 17-year-olds who are going to play quarterback for USC in 2 years. We're seeing that on the soccer side now. And to me, that is a really exciting, interesting moment for sort of soccer in this country. We've seen young people fall in love with this game through video games, through their parents not wanting them to play American football, so they push them into soccer and they fall in love with the game. But something we have seen a little bit is once folks hit their late teens, 20s, they go to college, they sort of enter more of kind of the American adult culture, which is built around watching the NFL on Sundays and drinking beers or going to college football games. They drift away from the game. But we're not seeing that as much. And for me, I think that's kind of the final sort of evolution in American soccer fandom is we've seen that there's this passionate youth, like adulation of the game. It's really soccer and NBA for a decade now. If you ask anyone under the age of 21, those are the sports they care about. But then NFL kind of takes over eventually. And for me, I'm curious to see, now that we have these ability to watch these games, not very smaller tournaments that have great TV coverage, not like grainy feeds that you're watching on some sketchy thing on your computer that will give you a virus. Can we turn those fans into kids who love the game, into adults who love the game, and make that sort of part of their life, part of their TV viewing life, part of their attending MLS games, US soccer games, Mexican national team soccer games, who play in the United States and sell out massive stadiums. That to me is kind of the next step that I'm really excited to witness.
This is a little bit of an extension from there. Nate, maybe you can start us off and tee up Neil on this one. And we got a number of questions along these lines. The question is about having US players playing domestically as they're developing through their states, through their clubs, and then into the college environment here versus developing abroad. And then a little bit more attention in the Q&A from the notion of, do we want players playing here in the MLS? Or do we want them playing abroad in the Premier League or the Bundesliga? How do we feel about domestic versus abroad in terms of how we see the game developing?
I think Neil and I could talk about this for about 10 hours. This is the big debate going on on sort of I think both the men's and women's side right now. And this is something that former US men's national team coach Jurgen Klinsmann was a very vocal proponent of our young players getting abroad and playing in kind of the top leagues in the world. And that did not sit well with people running MLS here, with the idea that we are on our way to being a top league in the world. And so I mean, I think this is one of those times where it's really kind of a rising tide lifts all ships. I think we should be looking at improving the MLS game and the development academies to, make MLS a league where we can foster young talent and then develop them to being some of the best players in the world. At the same time, those teams over there are very good at what they do, and I think this is kind of an exciting time to see players, thrive in both locations. Seen MLS players come up, make the leap to Europe. We've seen people go to Europe as teens. Um, yeah, I'm curious how Neil looks at it, because I know he has to sit in on meetings with the MLS executives as well, who are very sensitive about this subject. But I'm curious how you see it, Neil.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and Nate's right. One that's talked about and discussed a lot. I always view it from a player's perspective. So there's not a right answer to this, at least not from a, everyone perspective. It's dependent on the specific player. And so what you want to be doing as a player is testing yourself and getting better all the time, right? And that may mean you are playing in college, and then you go into the academy, and then you go to, pro. And then you go from there. It could be that you're better suited to be in MLS. And, our fans debate this a lot, right, Nate? Oh, MLS players aren't as good as European players. But I mean, Clint Dempsey went through college and then, played in MLS and then tested himself at the highest levels in the Premier League. Landon Donovan did, a similar thing, but felt more comfortable playing in MLS, and that's okay. Like it's really dependent on what's best for the player, and players develop at different times. Talking about Green Bay again, Jay DeMerit, some may know his story. He went to, couldn't get even a sniff in MLS, went over to the English Premier League and was at playing at the lowest level Division 7, and kind of made his way and then made it to the national team. So players develop at different times, and they really got to do what's best for them. And just keep in mind, always test yourself. And I'll real quick just say Tyler Adams too, part of our development academy, was part of New York Red Bulls, played there, then was like, hey, I need my next challenge. Then went overseas to, Salzburg, was tested there. And then I need my next challenge. And he's in Leeds now. And guess what? At some point he may need the next challenge to another team. Like, I think that's the kind of perspective a player should have. And it's not about MLS, overseas, staying home. It's about what's best for the player.
And quickly, what I'll add is I've actually heard a pretty compelling argument that our unique setup over here is, in some ways, it can be a kind of a superpower for American players, because a player like Clint Dempsey, 22 years old, is at Furman College. Matt Turner, our goalkeeper at this World Cup, was playing Stonehill or whatever I don't even remember the name of the college that he was at. If they were in England, they would be plumbers at that age, because it wouldn't have worked at 22. They would have been done, their careers would have been over. But in the States, there is that second chance. There is the college, there is the university system that allows players to find themselves later, in ways that is very, very rare over there. Jamie Vardy is probably the one example of a player who kind of blossomed late and had his chance with the England national team. But for most players, if you're not polished by 18 or 19, it's time to find your next profession. And I do think that can be sort of a unique way of viewing a strength for the United States, is that we allow players to take a little bit longer to find themselves.
Thank you both for that. I'm watching the time. There is actually one question in here that neither of you can answer, so I'm going to take it. And it makes my heart really happy. Someone's asking about what soccer looks like here in Vail and in Eagle County. So I just want to share, we're very lucky here to have several A licensed coaches that have chosen to make their life here in our little community. We have the Vail Valley Soccer Club, which starts in 8s and 10s and takes them through 18s. We've got state champ contenders in there. And then our high school teams are really fun to watch. And despite the fact that Denver is currently playing on grass and we are shoveling our fields from under several feet of snow, our teams compete at the state level. And we've had some players go on to play in college and to play overseas from our little community. So thank you for that question. That's so wonderful. There were a lot of questions in here about the 26 World Cup and how to prepare. Unfortunately, we didn't get to those. And what that tells me is, gentlemen, we may have to reconvene sometime in the next 3 years as we're leading into North America hosting the World Cup in 26. I want to thank you both genuinely for sharing your time and your talent with us tonight, spreading the love of the game in our mountain community here. Really means a lot to me personally, and I know our audience was really excited. To those of you at home, thank you so much for tuning in. And this recording will be available online in about a week's time, and we would love for you to share that with your friends. Nate Scott, thank you. Neil Buethe, thank you so much. We're very grateful. Everybody else, have a safe drive home. We'll see you guys out there. Have a good night.